So for starters, there are a bunch of seats up front. There are 3 at this table. I see 2 over here, 1 over here, 2 at this table. Please do come forward while we're talking. It's okay, and come find a seat. You don't need to stand. Dan, thank you so much for hosting us and for joining us today. And that was a very interesting conversation with Ambassador Hutchison and Stephen Walt, regular FP contributor. If you like his thoughts and line of thinking, subscribe and you'll get more of it. What I think would be super helpful right now is to understand a bit more about what the public thinks. We talked a lot about politics and how support for NATO may wax or wane and how that relates to what might happen going forward. Would love to understand a bit more from Gallup's perspective and your research on how that actually plays out and what that looks like. So would love to talk about public perceptions of NATO in the US and abroad, the factors influencing support or opposition, those 2 things, and the potential for what that might hold for NATO in future going forward based on those perceptions and shifts. So let's dig right in and talk about public perceptions of NATO.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gallup's recent analysis highlighted varying levels of support globally. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we have a slide, some data here. You can't come to Gallup and not get some data out of it. When we look at support of NATO across NATO members here, on the whole, the alliance seems to be doing pretty well in the eyes of the public. Over 2/3 of NATO members currently approve of the alliance, and that's at the majority of NATO states as well. So you can see sort of the variation here. U.S. falls somewhat in the middle, and there's some patterns in the resilience of support across the alliance, but by and large, we see that most people who live within these countries are approving of leadership.
Great, and it would be great to talk a little bit about that support, especially in light of the war in Ukraine and what has happened over the course of the past couple of years. Maybe you could dive into, we're not going to go through all of these countries, no, but maybe you could dig into one, perhaps the U.S. would work, and tell us a little bit about how that perception has shifted over time.
Yeah, absolutely. If we actually, when we hit the next slide here, have been asking about views of NATO in the U.S. for a very long time. The first slide, by the way, data from Gallup's World Poll, which we ask every year in over 140 countries, really giving a voice to the general population in all of those places. This we're shifting to the Gallup Poll Social Series, which is something started by our founder, George Gallup, back in the 40s. You can see here we've got trends going back to really in the height of the Cold War on favorability towards NATO. And in this case, what we're looking at is the percentage who think that the U.S. should either maintain or increase support for the NATO alliance over time. Big thing that jumps out at me is it's actually a little bit higher today than it was in 1990, right at the fall of the Berlin Wall into the Cold War. And then we've also, of course, we're really interested in what's happening today in the election cycle, what the implications could be. We heard great comments from the ambassador on this earlier. We've actually seen a slight increase in support among the U.S. public since we asked in 2022 in our most recent data.
Does that seem counterintuitive and surprising based on what we're hearing politically? And we were just hearing Stephen Walt and the ambassador talk about the fringes, and how those are affecting opinion. So is this really the minority that has this view? And it seems like overall the public support for NATO is strong. That's what this data is telling us. Does it seem counterintuitive then?
I think in many ways, and if we hit the last slide here, there's clearly differences by party affiliation. So members of the GOP are less robust in their support for NATO overall, as the ambassador intuited, thinking maybe about some of the elite messengers and representatives, those that will be in the pages of foreign policy expressing their opinions. Democrats tend to have higher views, higher favorability of NATO overall. But even within the Republican Party, we see that a majority of Republicans, self-identified Republicans in the U.S., support either maintaining or increasing support for NATO. And again, that's where the movement has been since 2022, and the movement has been in a positive direction. Republicans are more likely to say that the U.S. should support the alliance today than they were a few years ago. And to the point about the fringes, we've also seen the opposite side. It's not on the slide. But in 2022, when we asked this question, there was a sizable minority of Republicans, about 22%, who thought the U.S. should pull out of NATO altogether. That number's decreased since 2022 to 16%. So obviously, that core of the GOP that's watching what's going on in Europe right now, watching what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, sees the value of NATO coming across.
Fascinating data points. Maybe you could help pull apart a little bit what you read out of that. What are the drivers of that support, and why is that the case? Is it just fear over what's happening in the world? What are some of those the decisive factors that go into support for leadership in NATO?
Yeah, there's two things that we see, and so we've actually done some modeling on this data, trying to understand exactly that, what predicts. When we look across, kind of thinking back to the original data points we talked about, all of those member states, and we try and look at all of the data that we have, what predicts whether or not someone is going to approve of NATO leadership? Two factors. The first is definitely external perceptions, so the threat perception here, the alliance is here as a defensive alliance. Views of Russia are clearly predictive, but also views of U.S. leadership, views of German leadership, the role of the major players within NATO. If somebody is in a European country approves of U.S. leadership, they're 3.4 times more likely to approve of NATO's leadership as well. On the other side, if somebody disapproves of Russian leadership, twice as likely to approve of NATO leadership. Now, in Europe right now, you've got like 8% that approve of Russian leadership, so that's almost a constant in the data.
Right.
But it's a big factor. That's the first thing, so that external threat orientation. The second piece, and I think this is really interesting in the context of what we see in our election, what we're seeing in European elections right now, obviously we just got the French results yesterday, is views of domestic institutions really matter. And it's actually an even bigger predictor than views of those international powers. So if you look at people's approval of the military in their country, their confidence and honesty of elections, views of the financial system, national government, people who approve, who have confidence in those institutions, are significantly more likely to have confidence in NATO. We also see that for confidence in the EU, by the way. So that role of the internal institutions really is influencing what people see internationally.
Okay, that makes sense. But that's also a very concerning trend then, because what we perceive, and I think the result of a lot of these elections and everywhere really, you could start with France, go back to the UK as well, is against what the standing majority, and that seems like there's less trust then, and we're definitely seeing that in the U.S. So how would you interpret that for this data going forward? I know you don't have a slide on what the future will tell us and what that support will look like. What's your take? What's your sense of how that will play out going forward?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there's real risk at the heart of what is the core communal identity project that is NATO, what's holding these countries together. And if you look at it, again, Ambassador made some of these comments about the economic alliance, the importance of the relationships between these countries. This isn't just self-interested, we've got to keep ourselves safe. That's a part of it. But it's also about these are countries that hang together, have free market economies, have liberal democracies to varying degrees. But at the same time, if we see that these institutions are eroding and the challenge of far-right parties in Europe and some of the challenges we see with some of those fringes of parties in the U.S., further erosion of those institutions is definitely creating risk for the alliance long term. And personally, we were talking about this beforehand, my concern is what happens when this war is over. This war will end, hopefully sooner rather than later, but this war is going on. When Russia is no longer seen as the clear and present danger taking headlines, when we're not hearing about Russian combat actions and that aggression abates, does the alliance persevere through that next phase? We'll see.
Russia has united NATO. So 75 years, NATO's been around for a while. It has bobbed and weaved and served various purposes. It actually wasn't supposed to be a 75-year enterprise. The concept was to get us through the post-war period and keep Europe peaceful. It finds itself in that role again, and the U.S. playing a big role in that. That's a lot of adaptability that NATO has demonstrated over this time. Even the only time Article 5 has been invoked is actually in support of the U.S. after 9/11. What's your sense of the long-term trend? You just questioned that basically after Russia's war is over, that immediate threat will be gone. What's your own take on how NATO will be able to adapt going forward and continue in the very, very long term?
Yeah, I think the key is how does it adapt to long-term evolving security threats. The looming thing we haven't talked about yet is China.
Right.
And the U.S. concerns about pivot towards Asia, orientation towards China. I think it's interesting right now when you see Europeans taking actions on Chinese electric vehicles, for instance. We've seen huge shifts in global opinion towards China over the last few years. It's not the focus of what we're talking about today, but that unifying effect of people's concerns about Chinese behavior over the long term, Can NATO continue to pivot in that direction and show that that's a unified alliance, not just for threats in the European theater, but also for global threats? I think that's the key to resilience, is showing that they can move outside of Europe.
You're quite right. We could have a whole separate discussion about China, and I'm sure we will talk about it later today. Maybe some more data we can share at another point in time. But this has been really insightful and great to level set what public opinion says about NATO as we have this discussion around it going forward. As my colleague Stephen Walt said so brilliantly, no shortage of topics, but we're out of time, so we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Dan Foy of Gallup.
Thank you.
Well done.
Please welcome to the stage